Hi everyone, how are you doing today? Well, after long last, I am presenting to you my book review of Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. A couple of disclaimers before I jump into this. This is going to be a full, in-depth kind of analysis of the novel, so unlike my usual videos, I will be going over major spoilers. So if that's not what you're looking for, be warned ahead of time. A couple other things I feel I need to mention. I've only read this novel once, so I am just going off of my first impressions of reading it through. And I'm not a teacher or professor by any means, so I've tried to do my due diligence here with the research and commentary, but it's just my personal opinion, so take it with a grain of salt, if you will. Last thing, just to get it out of the way, this is a Russian novel. I am not somebody who deletes comments or, tries to do anything like that, but given the current situation, I know some people may be tempted to take this into a political angle, and I really want to keep my channel free of that, so I will be removing any comments that are not related to this book or my review. So with all of that out of the way, let's talk about Crime and Punishment. And it's a huge novel. It took me the better part of 4 months to read. And I would say that, there's no way I can possibly cover everything in one book review. This is just some of the things that really stood out to me. So 3 things to know about Dostoyevsky. And really, I want to go back into sharing author biographies in my reviews and focusing on 3 key points. The reason for that is none of us has, or at least a few of us, have the brain storage to remember more than 3 things about a famous person. And, this helps us kind of focus in on the most important things. Dostoyevsky lived through the middle part of the 1800s. He was born in 1821. It was the same year Napoleon died, and we'll come back to Napoleon a bit later. And Dostoyevsky died in 1881, which was about 2 decades after Tsar Alexander II emancipated the serfs. Dostoyevsky was one of those authors who had a broad range of life experience. He worked as an engineer early in life. He later became a journalist. And he also spent time in Siberia for some politically incorrect views and activities. So Siberia, another place that comes up again later in this novel. And then the third thing you really should know about Dostoyevsky is he had, very strong opinions about the world, and his personal life and beliefs are very well represented in his novels. And I guess summarized, you could describe him as somebody who strongly rejected the 19th century trends towards atheism in society. And not just atheism, but ideologies which prescribed a system of the world centered around atheistic socialism versus a more traditional or even socialist Christian society where God and the church are at the center. And this is a conflict that comes up in various of his novels. My understanding, and I haven't read into this very deeply, but what I've seen is that he really wanted to see a shared Orthodox Christian identity for all Slavic people. And this little bit of knowledge, I think, helps clarify some of his messages in his novels and even the way that the novels develop. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. In spite of any issues he may have had with the emergence of liberalism and democracy and that sort of thing, Dostoyevsky was still greatly impacted by many Western authors and works, including Don Quixote and also the works of Shakespeare, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So a brief overview of Crime and Punishment before we delve into some of the themes and so on. It was published in 1866, first serially, and interestingly, right around the same time as Tolstoy's War and Peace, which I'm sure many of you have read or heard of. Crime and Punishment is one of those classics whose reputation just completely precedes itself. Almost everyone's heard of it, and everyone seems to know it is a classic novel, even if they haven't read it before or know anything much about it. So, very monumental work to approach. This was actually my second attempted reading. The first time I tried to read Crime and Punishment was in my late teens, and I got a decent ways into the book and just gave up because I felt it was way too bleak and depressing. Little did I know that was just the beginning. My next attempt at reading anything by Dostoyevsky was a little bit later. I was taking a college course called The History of Russia and the USSR, and I thought, well, why don't I try reading The Idiot, because I like the sound of this book, and that was really when I became enamored of Dostoyevsky's writing. I've mentioned this before, but The Idiot is one of those books that has just stayed with me ever since I read it. It's been about 10 years now, and I don't know, this isn't a review about The Idiot, but that was the first time I read Dostoyevsky and just was really struck by the power of his writing. And then I went on to read Notes from the Underground, and also, of course, The Brothers Karamazov. I did a very long book review of this on my blog, which you can check out if you're interested. But I read those. I also read White Nights, which is a collection of short stories, and The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, most recently, which is another short story. So he's one of those authors, I think, if you read him once and if you like him at all, you just sort of get into this this phase where you read and reread Dostoyevsky. It was inevitable for me to return to Crime and Punishment, so that's what I did starting last October. So what's it about? It's about this guy who's a former student. His name is Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov. And by the way, if I butcher these pronunciations, I'm really sorry. I did a bit of research to see how they're supposed to be pronounced, but I don't actually know Russian, so bear with me. I'm sorry if I goof this up. Anyway, Raskolnikov is a 23-year-old man, like I said, a former student. He's very charismatic and handsome. This is something Dostoyevsky points out explicitly. And Raskolnikov is mourning the loss of his fiancée, who was his landlady's daughter, who died, and spends most of his time cooped up in his tiny room. He's fallen upon hard times, and he's just sort of not really doing anything, just stuck in his room in St. Petersburg, not really doing schooling, not teaching or working. And he just learned something that, takes his current situation and makes it infinitely worse. He gets a letter from his mother that says his sister Dunya has entered an engagement of convenience to a wealthy man. This wealthy man's name is Pyotr Petrovich Lushin. And Lushin's character is extremely questionable. That much he can tell from this letter. Heartbroken and enraged, Raskolnikov concocts a plan to murder an old pawnbroker he knows, who is a stingy old woman nobody likes and who abuses her intellectually disabled sister, Lizaveta. So his thought with this is, this old woman, nobody likes her, she's giving people grief, and I can murder her, take her money, and use it to good. The thing about this is, that's the story he's sort of telling himself at the beginning, trying to justify it to himself, but in reality, he's been thinking about the way society works, the way certain people seem to be able to get away with crimes and do whatever they want, and nobody censures them, or at least even if they are censured, they somehow rise above it and become heroes. Case in point, Napoleon and all that he did, which has come down in history as being more heroic versus evil. which is debatable, and I'll have more to say about that. But basically, Raskolnikov, and he wrote an article about this, which gets published. Basically, he sees himself as being a potential Napoleon, and he thinks, I just need to test myself, commit this murder, and see if I too can rise above it. And, I see all these people in my life suffering. Maybe I can help them and also prove to myself that I am more than these other people, and I do not need to abide by laws of morality or things of that nature. So that is kind of his mentality. But things do not go as planned with this murder. The murder itself is described in horrifying language, not explicitly so much, but just the way that Dostoyevsky puts you inside Raskolnikov's shoes and then leads you up to the point of the murder. This was something I'd been hoping to see in Donna Tartt's The Secret History, which is also about a protagonist who commits murder. But in Tartt's novel, she doesn't show us it happening in great detail. She just kind of leads up to it, and it just leaves it at that. In Crime and Punishment, you are there when it happens, and it is so horrifying and so chilling because you've already developed this empathy for Raskolnikov. And so when he follows through with it, it's just that much more horrible because of the feeling that you've already developed for this character. He doesn't just violently murder this woman. He also ends up murdering the half-sister Lizaveta because she's there as a witness. And this is the point where he just kind of loses it. The story almost devolves into dark comedy because he's just lost control, and he doesn't even commit the robbery fully. He just takes a few things, doesn't really pay attention to what he's doing, and leaves. And then he kind of ends up falling ill, but partly insane and paranoid that people are going to find out what happened. So that's the great part of the beginning of this novel. Somebody described the book to me as cyclical, meaning something that happens in cycles. And I would agree with that. This is not a very clear-cut novel or linear detective story. It is more iterative and repetitive, and in each of these iterations, Raskolnikov is processing what he has done. He's trying to hide what he's done from others, and he feels constantly tormented, both by his illness and this love-hate desire in him to confess. So that sort of summarizes what happens in this book, but there are many little subplots and characters I'm going to be going over here in a minute. Something to know about Crime and Punishment is that it didn't start out as a book about murder, but the original concept was a book that was going to be called The Drunkards. This quote from Wikipedia kind of sums up what The Drunkards was going to be about. The present question of drunkenness in all its ramifications, especially the picture of a family and the bringing up of children in these circumstances. So the first part of Crime and Punishment actually really does stay true to that original concept, and alcoholism is a huge theme at the beginning of the novel, and it also persists throughout the rest of the story. Raskolnikov strikes up this strange acquaintance with this man named Marmeladov. He is an alcoholic. He's been a government employee at some times. And it turns out Marmeladov, under the influence of alcohol, has squandered his family's future and driven his wife Katerina to a kind of madness. Katerina is used to a better life, so she is absolutely enraged at her husband for being an alcoholic. And in the midst of this, she goads his teenage daughter, Sonia, into selling herself to provide for the family. And Sonia rather than letting her half-siblings die from starvation, she does exactly what her stepmother tells her to do. The problem is, once she's done it once, she's stuck in that lifestyle. She's forced to register herself as a yellow card prostitute, and that's just like the beginning of the downfall of Sonia. Raskolnikov is really drawn towards this family and their plight, and he ends up meeting Sonia and becomes strangely attracted to her. She's timid and beautiful and also very religious, which begins to leave a impression on him that he never fully faces till towards the end of the novel. I guess you could call it a love at first sight story, but it develops into something much deeper than that. It becomes a spiritual anchor in his life that he just can't separate himself from. Another scene of drunkenness from Crime and Punishment has to do with this dream or flashback that he has going back to his childhood. Now, this may or may not have actually happened. It may just be a symbolic representation of his current state of mind. Basically, he goes back to being a child, and as a child, he's watching this crowd of drunken people come out of a tavern, and led by the owner, this group of people beats an old cart horse to death. Of course, Raskolnikov, the child, is absolutely terrified and grief-stricken, and his father has to rescue himself from this situation. His father tells him, they are drunk, they are brutal, it's not our business. I think this either formative experience or just a dream, if you will, really says a lot about Raskolnikov, because he's not merely somebody without any morals. He does have a heart, and he does believe in justice. And the fact that his father was trying to tell him, we can't get involved in this, we must get away from this crowd. Well, you could do probably a whole video on the role of the crowd or the role of people in Crime and Punishment, but that's also very, very telling. Because Raskolnikov, by contrast to his father, actually does want to do something about injustice. The other thing I'll point out is this seems to be a really good indication or an example of the inner child concept, which comes up in psychology and therapy and has its origins in the work of Carl Jung. You can think of the inner child as being the emotional side of a person, and there's all these impressions, habits, and ideas that first form in our childhood and that persist into adulthood. Therapists will say that the inner child is associated with creativity, intuition, and sometimes fanciful coping mechanisms that help us survive when we're young, but can hinder us as we become adults. So again, I don't think this was necessarily intentional on Dostoyevsky's part, especially given that Jung came after Dostoyevsky. But these are very strong parallels, and I think that this gets developed even a bit more later on when Raskolnikov's mother talks about this change in his personality that happens as he changes from the more emotionally open child to the more closed off and moody adult. So that was just something that stood out to me about that scene. The last note on drunkenness that I'll just mention here is that this man who initially confesses wrongly to the murder, his name is Nikolai. He's also considered to be a drunkard and is said to be seeking punishment for his sins through the pursuit of suffering. This concept of the pursuit of suffering is mentioned several times. It's not something I'm going to be going into in depth in this review, but it's worth keeping in mind as we look at the themes in this book. So, yes, the Drunkards, it's actually a really good example of what you can do as an author in terms of, you have an idea, but maybe it's not a full story in itself. Maybe it's more a series of vignettes in this case, or a series of types of characters combining it with one of your other ideas, making it into something a little bit more broader, a little bit more powerful, it can be a good way to use those ideas. So I thought that was very interesting. So from a writing perspective, we could talk about various references to other works of literature and writing. He mentions Livingston's travels at one point. He mentions the poet and philosopher Friedrich Schiller several times. I'm not so familiar with him beyond the name recognition. What I wanted to focus on for a little bit here is inspiration taken from Shakespeare. From what I understand, Dostoyevsky was certainly inspired by Shakespeare at various times, and there are pretty good evidences of this documented in his writing and his letters. So, for example, this one character in his novel Demons says, I proclaim that Shakespeare and Raphael are higher than the emancipation of the serfs, higher than nationality, higher than socialism, higher than the younger generation, higher than chemistry, higher than almost all mankind, for they are already the fruit, the real fruit of all mankind, and maybe the highest fruit there ever may be. So quite a bit of a hyperbole there from this character, but that's one novel reference that one of his characters says. But for a more explicit reference, we can look at this letter he wrote to his brother in 1838. And this is from a book called The Dostoyevsky Encyclopedia. It talks about his references to Hamlet and Othello. I wanted to focus in right now on what he said about Hamlet. The quote here from the encyclopedia says, I ask myself whether my melancholy ideas will ever pass. Man has been given but one manner of existence. The atmosphere in his soul comprises a merging of heaven and earth. But what a contrary child man is. The law of his spiritual nature has been broken. It seems to me that our world is but a purgatory for heavenly souls beclouded by a sinful idea. And he goes on, but down here he says, what a faint-hearted creature man is. Hamlet, Hamlet. When I recall these tempestuous, savage soliloquies of his that echo the groans of a torpid world, then neither melancholy nor complaint nor reproach grip my heart. My soul is so crushed by grief that I fear to try to comprehend it lest I tear myself apart. So I'm not the first person to find parallels between Hamlet and Crime and Punishment, but it was something that did occur to me just organically. I've read Hamlet years ago, and I recently saw the Kenneth Branagh movie production. There's just so many parallels. Let me read this little bit, though, from Hamlet, which I think is a very Raskolnikov way of thinking. Hamlet's trying to make up his mind to wreak revenge for his father's death upon his uncle, and he says, what is a man if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed? A beast, no more. Sure, he that made us with such large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fuss in us unused. Now whether it be bestial oblivion, or some craven scruple of thinking too precisely on the event, a thought which quartered hath but one part wisdom, and ever 3 parts coward, I do not know. Why yet I live to say, this thing's to do, sith I have cause and will and strength and means to do it. So that almost summarizes what Raskolnikov is thinking as he's trying to psych himself up to do this murder, and, you know, he just considers himself a coward for not doing it, not for any particular moral scruples. Both the protagonists of Hamlet and Crime and Punishment are logical to a fault. They feel overwhelmed by injustices of the world, angered by what they see as depravity, greed, and loss of innocence, and they decide to take matters into their own hands, leading to their own moral downfall and probable madness. They both see their mother as supposing to be this guardian of morality and become disappointed by her actions. In Raskolnikov's case, he cannot believe that his mother will allow his sister Dunya to enter a marriage with this very disgusting man, and in Hamlet's case, his mother having the relationship with his uncle just absolutely shocks him and he feels betrayed. In both stories, there's this female character who pretty much idolizes the hero. I mean, there's Sonia, who is just devoted to Raskolnikov no matter what. I think there's a bit of trauma bonding going on there, but she refuses to leave him, and Ophelia, of course, is driven mad by her love for Hamlet. Both the protagonists, again, being logical to a fault and having a sort of twisted sense of morality, they want to make sure that they are justifying their crime to themselves. So Hamlet is determined to catch his uncle in an act of evil before murdering him. And Raskolnikov, again, keeps talking to himself in these iterations of the story. He keeps convincing himself, I'm legitimate, I have a reason for doing this, and why am I any less than these dictators who have come and gone and just done what they thought was best. A lot of people question both the characters' sanity. That could be a whole video, but that's a very strong similarity. And then there's this general relationship between the death of a family and the deterioration of society, which shows up in both. So let's talk a bit now about the crime and this Napoleon idea of Raskolnikov's. Much has been written about the French cultural impact in Russia and why French was once the language of the upper classes. This shows up most notably in War and Peace and is also referenced in Eugene Onegin by Alexander Pushkin, which is one of my favorite books and Pushkin's considered to be the father of Russian literature. These are all things I recommend looking into. I'm not going to be going over them in a lot of depth, but it does help explain this complicated relationship between Russia and France of the time, so that in spite of Napoleon attempting and failing to invade Russia in 1812, there were a certain group of people that really admired him, and again, he was even praised by Pushkin. So I'll link to some resources about that in the description, but it's just something to keep in mind. Raskolnikov, as ever in the novel, represents not just himself, but a segment of society that shares his ideology and his what he considers to be his ideals. In fact, so here's a quote where Raskolnikov is talking to his friend Razumihin, and he says, "The real master to whom all is permitted storms Toulon, makes a massacre in Paris, forgets an army in Egypt, wastes 500,000 men in the Moscow expedition, and gets off with a jest at Vilna. And altars are set up to him after his death, so all was permitted. No, such people, it seems, are not of flesh, but of bronze." I think Dostoyevsky illustrates these crimes, both individual and institutional, that people just put up with or they allow. So not just Napoleon features here, but there's several other characters where this shows up. So Raskolnikov's sister Dunya is engaged to this slimy guy named Luzhin, who tries to take advantage of a scandal in her life and proposes marriage because he thinks she will be utterly beholden to him and basically become his slave in marriage. There's also this other character whose name is Svidrigailov, whose wealth and connections have glossed over a host of scandals, rapes, and suspected murders he has committed against servants, women, and girls. He reminded me a lot of the character Totsky from The Idiot, who is a child abuser, but has been allowed to exist in society without paying for his crimes. And then this sexual predator archetype is something that comes up again in Dostoyevsky's short story called A Christmas Tree and a Wedding. So, two characters that doing absolutely heinous things and yet are allowed to get away with it, You could think of this as the system sort of protecting them due to their wealth, status, and prestige. It should also be noted, just to go back to the drunkenness theme for a minute, neither of these two characters fall into the notion that their circumstances or addictions are the cause of their misdeeds. In fact, Svidrigailov makes a point of saying he doesn't drink much, and Lucian, of all the characters, is the one that seems to be most in full control of his faculties at all times. So I don't think that Dostoyevsky is advocating for us to understand morality based upon environment or circumstances, but rather he is illustrating the separation of will and circumstances. So I'll just add on this note of the way he's showing these immoral deeds. I don't think Dostoyevsky can be portrayed as someone who is traditionalist at all costs, because he's clearly seeing and pointing out these horrific crimes of the upper classes. I mean, far more grotesquely than Charles Dickens at times. So you really do feel a lot of revulsion against these rich people that are getting away with things, which is voiced by Raskolnikov, and it's every bit as horrific as the murder that he commits. So there's still complexity here in the way Dostoyevsky is portraying tradition. So I just want to touch on a few more of the characters. And here I'd like to think about class. So I mentioned Marmeladov, the drunk ex-government official, earlier, and how he's married to this Katerina, who has a monomania about her previous status in society because she's fallen down. There's a similar examination of this, falling from higher social status in terms of Sonia, and the way she is treated terribly by many of the characters and is considered irredeemable in society, with the exception of the way she's treated by Raskolnikov and his sister Dunya. In fact, the meeting between the sister and Sonia is a major turning point because she just feels restored by somebody showing her empathy and acceptance. This class angle, if you will, also extends to Raskolnikov himself and the question of what is a gentleman. What is a gentleman? It comes up repeatedly, the idea that gentlemen are above certain kinds of crimes, such as an axe murder. And of course, he completely disproves this notion that crime is, particular to a certain kind of class. And then, of course, this is also shown to us in the character of Lucian, the slimy fiance I mentioned earlier, who makes a show of his status and class, patronizing others, and will throw other people under the bus if he feels it is advantageous to him. My favorite character in the book could well be considered one of the few middle class characters, if you could say there is a middle class. Razumihin, the loyal and loving friend of Raskolnikov, willing to go to bat for him in pretty much any situation. And I also think of him as maybe like a foil or an anti-shadow to Raskolnikov, sort of symbolizing what Raskolnikov could be if he was not tied up in his ideology. So, and Razumihin also provides some of the only humor in this book, some of the only comic relief. Another thing that I just want to mention, not too much in detail, but the way Dostoyevsky uses the supernatural or surreal elements in Crime and Punishment to bring about, partly to increase the drama of the story, but also to bring about spiritual changes in Raskolnikov. There's at least one ghost story in this book. There's various dreams. I mentioned the one about the horse earlier. There's another dream I'll talk about here in a moment. Certain characters just appear out of nowhere, as it were. When Raskolnikov first meets Svidrigailov, The latter just sort of shows up in his room out of the blue. There's another scene where Raskolnikov just is walking along and suddenly sees his sister at the bridge, and it's kind of interesting. Surrealist elements like this are not unique to Crime and Punishment. Dostoyevsky also used them in The Brothers Karamazov. So he likes using those as plot devices. And it kind of adds to this general question or theme in the book, which is, what is truth? This quote from Razumihin says, "Facts are not everything. At least half the business lies in how you interpret them." And he's saying this in this kind of offhand, funny way, but most of the book is told in such a way that you're not really sure who you can believe. Parts of it are even like a detective story, but again, you can't feel like you trust everybody's account of the events. And the narrator is somewhat unreliable as well. Or not the narrator, but the protagonist. And the book, too, is about, it's not about the facts of the murder. Those are very, very straightforward, very upfront. The question the book poses is the interpretation of facts as being reality, more so than facts itself. Raskolnikov doesn't see himself as a murderer. He sees himself as a anti-hero, someone who acts upon his particular principles. And his main critique of himself is that he is not strong enough to physically or mentally endure the consequences. Even up to the point of his eventual confession, he doesn't view himself as guilty, but rather as a failure to his belief system. And I think those are themes that still hold relevance for us today. So I'm going to go over the ending of the book now because, as I said, the story is not very linear. There is a certain sequence of events, but it just seems to go in circles until we finally get to the end. Let's just start with this quote here. Raskolnikov is reflecting on his motives, and he says, or he thinks, mere existence had always been too little for him. He had always wanted more. Perhaps it was just because of the strength of his desires that he had thought himself a man to whom more was permissible than others. Again, up to the last pages of the book, his conscience doesn't trouble him. What does trouble him is a severe lack of feeling and motivation to live or to die, which is something he half envies in Svidrigailov, who is able to at least have some emotions attached to his outlook on the world. And not just emotions, but in his case, a lack of will to live. Whereas in Raskolnikov, there's just sort of this apathy in general. Before I kind of talk about the very ending, I think that, there's a few pointers to it. For example, when Raskolnikov confesses his crime to Sonia, Dostoyevsky describes this as the feeling of flinging himself down from a steeple. And there's a lot of things, especially in his interactions with Sonia, that point towards this religious conversion. And so I was reminded most of the road to Damascus from the book of Acts in chapter 9. It's talking about this man Saul, who was persecuting the Christians and had this extraordinary experience. And I'll just read a few verses here from that account. So it says, "Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. As he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. Then he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And he said, 'Who are you, Lord?' Then the Lord said, 'I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. It is hard for you to kick against the goads.' So he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what do you want me to do? Then the Lord said to him, Arise and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. And the men who journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice but seeing no one. Then Saul arose from the ground, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no one. But they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus, and he was 3 days without sight, and neither ate nor drank. This is an example of one of the more dramatic conversions in Scripture, and we see something similar happen with Raskolnikov in prison in Siberia. So first of all, he has this very strange dream, and I'm going to read you this dream because it relates to what I just read from the book of Acts, but it also kind of poses itself as this turning point in his life and something that kind of helps shake him out of his apathy. He dreamt that the whole world was condemned to a terrible new strange plague that had come to Europe from the depths of Asia. All were to be destroyed except a very few chosen. Some new sort of microbes were attacking the bodies of men, but these microbes were endowed with intelligence and will. Men attacked by them became at once mad and furious. But never had men considered themselves so intellectual and so completely in possession of the truth as these sufferers. Never had they considered their decisions, their scientific conclusions, their moral convictions so infallible. Whole villages, whole towns, and people went mad from the infection. All were excited and did not understand one another. Each thought that he alone had the truth and was wretched looking at the others, beat himself on the breast, wept, and wrung his hands. They did not know how to judge and could not agree what to consider evil and what good. They did not know whom to blame, whom to justify. Men killed each other in a sort of senseless spite. They gathered together in armies against one another. But even on the march, the enemies would begin attacking each other. Their ranks would be broken, and the soldiers would fall on each other, stabbing and cutting, biting and devouring each other. The alarm bell was ringing all day long in the towns. Men rushed together, but why they were summoned and who was summoning them, no one knew. The most ordinary trades were abandoned because everyone proposed his own ideas, his own improvements, and they could not agree. The land, too, was abandoned. Men met in groups, agreed on something, swore to keep together, but at once began on something quite different from what they had proposed. They accused one another, fought and killed each other. There were conflagrations and famine. All men and all things were involved in destruction. The plague spread and moved further and further. Only a few men could be saved in the whole world. They were a pure chosen people, destined to found a new race and a new life, to renew and purify the earth. But no one had seen these men. No one had heard their words and their voices. So that's a pretty dramatic and unsettling dream Raskolnikov has. And a couple of things I would remark upon it. One is that Dostoyevsky is basically retelling or interpreting artistically the end times from scripture. And the ending of it, where it's talking about this few men who could be saved, is, to me, it seems pretty clearly a reference to Christianity, a race not of ethnicity, but of people that have discovered truth in the gospel. This is how Dostoyevsky is building up to this conversion of Raskolnikov, his Damascus moment, if you will. That, and then, Sonia follows him to Siberia, where he's undergoing his punishment, and one day he finally kind of sees what she's done for him, her self-sacrificial love, and it just kind of breaks through to him that agape has finally trumped eros for him. And even though he was always attracted to her, he finally can love her in that more pure and unearthly sense and find value in life again. So the novel ends with him reflecting upon her Christian convictions and the hope of sharing a life and faith together after his release. And then Dostoyevsky finishes it this way, hinting almost at a sequel that was never written. He writes, "That is the beginning of a new story, the story of the gradual renewal of a man, the story of his gradual regeneration, and of his passing from one world into another, of his initiation into a new unknown life. That might be the subject of a new story, but our present story is ended. All right, so that was my in-depth look at Crime and Punishment. Let me just wrap it up here with some more personal thoughts. First of all, this was a very difficult book to review, just both in terms of the subject matter and how to even process it. Many of the scenes in this book are completely breathtaking in the worst and the best ways. It is shocking and depressing, even coming from the perspective of a modern day reader. But stylistically as a novel, it is pretty slow and repetitive. I'm quite familiar with Dostoyevsky's use of long and philosophical conversations at this point. Usually that gives momentum to his plots, but in this book, it seemed to me it just slowed down the pace quite a bit. Some of this may be intentional. Again, the claustrophobia felt by the main character, and both in terms of physical space and his head space, these repetitive conversations kind of add to that. There's almost something modern in the way this is written, but I'd say for these reasons, it just may not appeal to everyone from a prose perspective or even a storytelling perspective. The ending is a happy ending, but I felt a bit unconvinced by it. This Damascus moment for Raskolnikov was certainly striking, but it just, I don't know, after everything that had happened already, I wasn't feeling it, I guess. It was hard for me to understand how he got to that point and what exactly destroyed his stubbornness, which had been persisting up to that very moment. I can easily imagine an alternate ending where Sonia, who still loves him but is despairing of change, ends up leaving Siberia and going back to her half-siblings, and Raskolnikov dying of grief and a hard heart. Comparing that to the ending of The Idiot, I felt The Idiot's ending was more tragic but more believable. This book, I think, I don't know, there's something kind of forced feeling about the happy ending. My most uncharitable assessment of the ending would be that Dostoyevsky wrote himself into a bit of a hole and rushed the ending. Very hot take on my part and controversial, I am sure, but that is sort of how I was feeling about it, if I'm being completely honest. But all that said, given how much there is in this novel that rings true today, and given how very quote-worthy it is, I don't know, I think it still holds a lot of substance, absolutely. The most famous quote maybe is, "Man can get used to anything, the villain." And later, Raskolnikov says, talking about the burden of his crime, "I shall get used to it." This apathy and cynicism in the novel is completely relevant to today, and I think is something that a lot of people will feel challenged by. Many times Raskolnikov, in spite of his ideology, still voices a yearning for love and justice that is a theme throughout the greatest novels ever written, and it still haunts us till today. Personally, I share Sonia's belief that redemption of humanity's darkness is found only in Christ, and so I readily empathize with the message of the novel. Due to the way the ending was written, however, I am not sure that it will necessarily change the minds or hearts of anyone who is not already a believer. Still, regardless of your political or religious background, I think the moral struggles of the book ought to provoke and challenge anyone who picks it up. And I think that all of this said, Crime and Punishment easily retains its classic status in the 21st century and is worth reading at least once. I don't know when I'll be attempting this novel again. Like I said, it took me about 4 months to read, but I feel like it is a book I will read again in the future, just for everything we talked about and maybe getting a better understanding of the ending and the character arc of Raskolnikov. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening to this very long review. I hope you're all well, and I will see you next time.